When I finished recording the videos for the gospel saturated module, there are three primary videos. One, what is the gospel? What does it mean to be gospel saturated? And of course, how do we grow in that gospel saturation? When I finished recording those videos, I decided to come up with some questions that could be used for personal evaluation and assessment to see how gospel saturated an individual really is. And here are those questions. I can identify in specific ways the way my life has changed as a result of the gospel. And the spectrum would be from not at all, I can't identify any ways, to totally, I see a lot of ways. That's the evaluative question. How confident am I that I can clearly articulate the basic gospel? Similar spectrum, not at all confident or totally confident. When I sin, do I tend to turn to God for forgiveness, or do I, in some measure, run and hide? And of course, part of that running and hiding is then dwelling on the guilt and maybe thinking that there is some time that needs to pass before you can be forgiven, or something you need to do, or in some way you need to suffer. Of course, the reason I can articulate that challenge so well is I've faced it at different times in my life. And the more we shy away from God when we sin, the less we understand the gospel in its completeness. How readily do I extend grace and forgiveness to others as I have received grace and forgiveness from Christ? Do I extend it very reluctantly or freely? The parable of the unmerciful servant, where the man was forgiven millions and millions and millions of dollars and would not forgive someone who owed him a cup of coffee, basically. That parable isn't so much showing how unridiculous forgiveness is as how impossible it is to be so unforgiving when you've forgiven so much. It's illogical. It makes no sense. It's impossible. And so the more freely I extend grace and forgiveness to others, it shows how much I understand how much and how freely I myself have been forgiven. Do I find my primary identity in my relationship with Christ? Or do I seek validation from others? And the spectrum would be, I seek validation from others. Across the spectrum to, I receive my validation from my relationship with Jesus Christ. If God has accepted you and you're adopted into his family and you are a brother with Christ and you're seated with him in the heavenlies, that's your primary identity. And it doesn't matter what anybody else says or even what you think, that is your identity. And we need to rest in that. In a time of crisis, is my first reaction, my first tendency to trust in Jesus, or to in some way lean on my own understanding? The spectrum is leaning on my own understanding versus seeking God's wisdom in a time of crisis or challenge. Here's an interesting one. And I don't know if this would have come to my mind apart from all the time I've been spending reflecting on the gospel and how it affects us. The gospel informs my attitude and response to social issues, injustice, and the needs of those around me. Not at all, or across the spectrum to totally. The reason this is such a challenging question is we live in a very politically charged time. And politics comes into play here. And there's all kinds of different frameworks in politics and all kinds of ways dividing people. And I've seen how if we lean to the right, we are sometimes reluctant to affirm things that may smell like they lean left, even though they may be biblical. Certain justice issues and racial issues. And do I look at these things? Do I look at politics, politicians even, that I disagree with, through the lens of the gospel? Or have I somehow managed to take that and make it a category all its own that doesn't interface with my spiritual life or my reception of the gospel at all? It's an important question. I'm actively praying for and seeking to share the gospel with those who need Jesus. That's a rather obvious one. We've received so much, we're wanting to pass it on to others. Here's another interesting one. I engage in spiritual disciplines to develop my relationship with God rather than out of a sense of duty, thinking it in some way gains me favor with him. This is a spectrum I've walked through my life, from seeking to gain favor, doing it from duty, versus using it to develop a relationship with God. And again, the more we understand the gospel, the more we understand we can't earn favor with God. And we understand how much he loves us and how much he wants to relate to us, that he created us for relationship with himself. And so we then engage in these spiritual disciplines to cultivate that relationship, rather than thinking it gains us some kind of points. I have good relationships within my church or faith community that helps me live out the implications of the gospel. This is about being in a community of other gospel-saturated, gospel-centered, on-mission people. Because if we're not there, if we don't have those kind of people around us, we will cool off, we will flounder, and our gospel saturation, it'll dry up. We need the body to keep us resting in the gospel. My joy and hope come from my secure future in Christ rather than my circumstances. The spectrum, of course, is from circumstances to in Christ. And this really highlights the idea that our circumstances come and go and change and shift, but there's something about our relationship with Christ, something about our identity, something about our hope that doesn't change with the circumstances. And that we revert to that anchor point when we face trials, when we face difficult times, that there is a joy that goes beyond circumstances, a peace that transcends understanding. And finally, the gospel shapes my view of life after death and increases my passion and anticipation of eternity. If we are saturated in the gospel, we understand that yes, it's about now, but it's also about forever. And as we face death or walk with others through death, we understand that the gospel speaks even to this, especially to this, because Jesus didn't just die on the cross, he rose from the grave. So those are a few questions, kind of self-examination, self-assessment questions I came up with after looking at the things I've been learning about gospel saturation. You might want to use them as your own little assessment and see how you're doing when it comes to resting in the finished work of Jesus.